Welcome to Customer Driven with Chad McDaniel. Well known throughout the customer leadership industry, Chad has been the chief community leader for Execs in the Know, one of the top executive customer advocacy groups on the planet. With a passion for customer success and a desire to share and develop best practices, Chad's conversations with industry leaders aim to give unfiltered, unplugged access to industry peers who are customer obsessed, just like you. If you enjoy the show, please be sure to rate and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. Now here's your host, Chad McDaniel.
Well, welcome to another episode of Customer Driven with Chad McDaniel. And again, I just want to say thank you to all of our listeners and welcome you to today's episode. And really, the intent of today's episode for our listeners is what I sort of see as the state of the state in regards to strategic outsourcing in 2019 and beyond. You know, it's interesting in our executive community of Execs in the Know, which for our listeners that might be familiar, we are a very large customer corporate peer group sharing insights and best practices with each other. And there's a lot of ways that we enable that. Part of it is through the podcast series. We do have a corporate-only online community called Know It All. If you do not have your profile set up, send me an email, chad@execsintheknow.com. Be happy to send you your unique link to join our online community where we have some very rich and robust discussions amongst the corporate community. But when I think of a lot of the members in the executive community of Execs in the Know, outsourcing continues to play one of the most fundamental strategic line items of the organization. If they're already outsourcing, maybe considering outsourcing, but the continued review and need and change evolution that continues to take place in that particular conversation. And when I say outsourcing, I'm really talking predominantly about call center voice outsourcing. And for a lot of you know, it's been around a long time. It's had its different ebb and flows of all sorts of change between the offshore, nearshore, domestic, and geopolitical, and we could kind of go down the list here. But for today's episode, I really wanted to bring in an insightful industry leader, John Billings from Hilton, who is the Director of Global Vendor Performance. Not only a mega user, and you don't have to be a mega user of outsourcing, but the point is John is going to bring such a dynamic perspective to not only what his massive footprint is, but really tuned into, again, kind of the state of the state and maybe some ideas around 2019 and where we think some of this is heading. So again, if you have not subscribed or subscribed to Customer Driven, please do so at the end of the episode. I'd love you to take a minute. Please rate today's show. Your feedback is so helpful to me, and I appreciate your listenership. And again, on iTunes, Stitcher, all the Spotify, all the major platforms, we're out there with this episode. So let's go ahead and begin. Welcome, listeners, to Customer Driven with Chad McDaniel. John Billings, thank you again for the opportunity to have your voice, your leadership, and your perspective. And what I'd like to do for our listeners, John, is I find it always best to have you introduce yourself, kind of set the stage for what your background is, what a day in a life, what some of the roles and responsibilities are, and then let's get into a great conversation. So, John, I'm going to turn it to you.
Sounds good, Chad, and thanks for inviting me today. So, just a little about me. I've been working with contact center outsourcers in some form or fashion for close to 15 years now. I've been with Hilton for a little bit over 2.5 years, and I'm part of Hilton Reservations and Customer Care, or HRCC, reporting up to the Vice President of HRCC. In this role, I'm responsible for all of Hilton's contact center related outsourcing functions, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail here in a moment. But a little bit more about my background. Prior to joining Hilton, I spent 2.5 years working for Teleperformance in a business development and solutions architect role, working with companies across a variety of industries to identify and establish outsourcing solutions across the onshore, nearshore, and offshore geographies. Before that, I was back on the buy side of the outsourcing relationship, managing vendor operations for Travelocity, the online travel agency. So as you can see, I've got both the buy and the sell side of the equation as it relates to outsourcing.
And John, that's great. And I just want to make sure we also, again, for the listeners, if you could kind of in today's model for you and Hilton, does that, how many locations or type of locations or any type of metrics you are able to share publicly about kind of your footprint in outsourcing?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a little bit of context here. At Hilton, in addition to an extensive virtual agent network in the U.S., we have several captive brick and mortar reservation centers across the globe in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. And supplementing that and complementing that, we have an extensive vendor partner network. And those centers are located in Asia, Central America, the Caribbean, Europe, and the Middle East. So we've got approximately 10 locations, 10 partner locations across the globe. We handle reservations and post-reservations functions across 14 different languages across the globe. And in addition to general reservations, we're handling property direct, customer service, guest assistance, and Hilton Honors related inquiries. And we service the guests across several channels, including voice that you mentioned earlier. We also support guests with through email, chat, social media, and through the Hilton Honors mobile app. And our outsourcing operation touches most, if not all, of those functions. So a very extensive vendor outsourcing operation.
John, would it be, again, just fair to say then from an you have a blended mix between in-sourced internally and then outsourced, but would it be fair to say that you're outsourcing seats 5,000, north of 5,000 seats or something to that regard?
No, it's around 2,500 or so, a little bit north of that. Won't get into specific numbers, but it's about half that from an outsourcing perspective, and a little bit more than that from a captive perspective.
Perfect. Well, again, obviously, John knows a thing or two about strategic outsourcing. So obviously an ideal guest for today's episode on customer driven, as I really wanted to have kind of a graduated discussion about sort of the state of the state. So John, thank you for that tee up. And again, for our listeners, you're listening to John Billings from Hilton. He's the Director of Global Vendor Performance. So, John, let's start kind of current state of state. And I mean, I guess in the last 10 years, we could have a whole discussion of where that's been, but I'd rather look forward and current and not necessarily historically unless we need to. But as we kind of discuss some of the observations of the current call center voice outsourcing industry, what are some of the trends or observations you're seeing or just change evolution? What's kind of on the mind, do you feel, of people like yourself and others that would be in your peer group right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Outsourcing is a very dynamic industry, as you've mentioned. It's evolved quite a bit over the last 10 years, and there's quite a few trends that I'm seeing just across the CX industry in general and across outsourcing. And while I'm not going to speak to all of them, I'll speak to a few that are certainly weighing on my mind right now. First, seeing quite a bit of M&A activity going on in the BPO industry. Just over the past few months, we've seen some large deals close. So, for example, Concentrix has acquired Convergys. Teleperformance just closed on their acquisition of Intelenet. Aegis and StarTech have merged. Just a few examples there. And I'm not going to go into, or I'm not going to speak to the reasons why the industry is consolidating. I mean, there are plenty of industry observers out there that can speak to that. However, I can tell you that companies like ours who outsource will need to think about how this impacts their overall vendor strategy. will the companies that they're involved with that are going through the M&A activity, will they be distracted by the integration? Will they take their eye off the ball? What aspects of their individual operating models stay intact? How will it impact pricing? What will other companies in the industry do in response? It's still a very fragmented industry. I mean, I get new companies calling me all the time, asking for business. I'm very fortunate to work for a name that attracts quite a few folks. So at the end of the day, I don't think there will be enough consolidation to have a material impact on pricing, but it'll be interesting to see how all this plays out. And it's something that I'm watching very closely, and something that we're being impacted by. We've got a couple of very trusted partners that have gone through or that are going through the merger and acquisition process as we speak. Second, we're also seeing skill shortages in certain markets, and these are driven by a number of factors. In some cases, new BPOs are coming into a market, increasing the need for talent. In other cases, certain high growth industries, such as the technology industry, they're seeming to have this insatiable demand for talent, which is increasing competition out there for the good talent. This in turn leads to increased agent turnover, as experienced agents who have very easily transferable skills seek higher pay and better career pathing opportunities. And in particular, we're seeing this in Europe right now. Several years ago, we placed work in Bulgaria, a very high growth market. And especially over the last year, we're seeing new BPOs come into the market. Wages are being impacted, competition for talent's being impacted. And as a result, we're feeling some of those impacts in the form of higher agent turnover. Another trend, companies like ours are thoughtfully investing in automation, identifying opportunities to automate certain tasks in an effort to both improve the overall customer experience and realize cost efficiencies. Here at Hilton, we've recently launched a chatbot, and we're watching closely to see how this impacts our overall customer satisfaction rates and to better understand the overall containment rate, which will ultimately impact our volume and cost structure on chat. There's a fair amount of uncertainty when you launch a new technology, in terms of exactly how much volume we'll be able to automate. And that creates, a certain amount of uncertainty around our planning for these particular workflows. Ultimately, we know the number of agents that we employ across the globe will decrease, which will mitigate some of the skill shortage risks that I mentioned just a minute ago. But the BPO industry will be forced to adapt, likely by developing or acquiring new technologies that add to their portfolio of services. It's a classic business strategy problem, right? If a BPO doesn't adapt on their own terms, the industry will adapt around them, and they'll be forced to do it on somebody else's terms. So this will likely drive further evolution across the BPO industry, which certainly could lead to additional M&A activity, like we had spoke about earlier. Lastly, I'm also seeing this is one that's very near and dear to my heart. I'm also seeing a changing approach to how companies manage their vendor partnerships. The nature of the BPO relationship is evolving. Many companies used to view BPOs as just another supplier, taking advantage of the labor arbitrage, taking an I win only if you lose approach to doing business by trying to extract the best possible terms and by closely monitoring every aspect of their vendor operation. While that certainly goes on, but as companies mature their outsourcing programs and as the industry matures, many have started to change the way that they manage partnerships and are taking a much more collaborative approach and recognizing that the BPO industry does much more than just provide low-cost labor. For example, we've been going through a multi-year culture change here at HRCC, and trust is a key tenet of our organization. That has caused us to rethink how we approach our vendor partnerships. Our our contracts, many of which were originally created years ago, about 10 years ago when we started outsourcing, speak to how we as an organization approached outsourcing, again, when it was fairly new and when we were certainly very new. Those contracts are hundreds of pages long. They're very complex, very inflexible, and they speak in minutia to every last detail of the agreement. As we've gained more experience in outsourcing and brought in people from outside of Hilton who have experience with outsourcing, we've definitely matured in terms of how we think about our vendor partnerships. We're in the process of reworking contracts, challenging ourselves to be less prescriptive, reducing the length and complexity of our contracts, and demonstrating trust in our partnerships and placing more emphasis at the end of the day on business outcomes.
John, let me jump in here. And again, great I think four examples you provided about observations and sort of current trend, and then even a little bit of a mini case study with Hilton and the cultural change and focused on trust and the contracts and everything in between. I want to add a couple of my thoughts. Been around a bit myself. I do believe that when I think of not just the maturity of the call center outsourcing space, but the capabilities from the supplier side have just been tremendously graduated, and I think for us as end user brands, we have a lot we can learn from the industry as a whole, or leveraging into the technology, some of the skill sets, but I think the capabilities have really elevated and done very, very well to all of our benefits. That's a personal opinion of mine, and I'm sure you've been around a while too. You've seen that direct change from our supplier community doing, I think, a really good job for the most part.
No, I'm sitting, or I'm being invited to more and more conversations that's about technology that the industry is bringing to bear, rather than just locations and cost. They're definitely bringing more to the table, which is a benefit to all of us.
John, just for my pricing may be a little bit off, but if I'm just trying to give some averages here and you could help me validate this, is it still typically, if you're thinking domestic in a productive hour, somewhere in $25 to $30 an hour, and then near shore somewhere in the $17 to $25 hours, and then offshore somewhere in that maybe $12 to $15? Does that sound about right, or would you adjust that at all?
No, that sounds about right. And, there are other locations such as India where you could probably get a little bit south of what you were talking about from an offshore perspective. So right. Those are definitely good ballparks to go by.
And it's not just, and again, for the brand users, clearly it's not just about the price. It's about aligning to a partner of culture alignment. There's voice representation and success of your brand. And I always try to put price as sort of a thought, but not the ultimate strategy. Know your customer, know your brand, and that relationship flourishes with that type of cultural alignment and change, even to what you were meaning to John earlier. One other quick question I want to ask you. I have you, John, on the call. Is there been a kind of a shift to nearshore? I mean, I still know Philippines huge, and the offshore, and we could go through the whole history there. But are you seeing a lot more shift to nearshore, or is it? And again, we're averages of averages here, but any thoughts around that, or is it the opposite?
No, I'm definitely hearing more about that. I would say, our strategy has remained intact. There's a lot going on in the world, but we're a mix of all three. Certainly, when it comes to our overall HRCC operation, we haven't shifted any strategies lately. But I know a lot more companies are coming to the table with nearshore solutions, and it's definitely something that I'm hearing more chatter about in the industry.
And again, you're listening to John Billings with Hilton, the Director of Global Vendor Performance. John, you know a thing or two about this space, as I've said throughout the episode. What's keeping you, outside of some of the observations we mentioned, and not to maybe duplicating that, but is there certain things that are kind of keeping you up right now or kind of got your attention and focus? I mean, Hilton is a leader in driving, I think, customer success and brand satisfaction. And you guys have all different ways that you approach the end customer resolution and support. And I think the vendor, I think you work with, you said a group of 10, but they play such an instrumental part. It all has to be synchronized and it has to be humming to make that what I call a true customer experience become real, regardless of channel support or if it's internal, external. John, give me your thoughts.
Well, I mean, you hit it on the head, and that's my job to bring it all together. At least when it comes to the vendor partnership side of things, we've got a great team, and as I had mentioned earlier, we are a mix of captive and outsourced operations, and there's an orchestration level, and that's a lot of what we think about, how we approach our vendors. As I was kind of speaking to with that in that last bullet point, we want our vendors to, I mean, they are an extension of our operation, and we want to do everything we can to make them feel like they are. And demonstrate to them that they are. We bring them into Dallas, for example, for an annual meeting where we talk about our overall HRCC strategy and where we're going for the year. So we have representatives come in from the various locations where, there is just a level of transparency and just an ongoing dialogue to make sure that it's orchestrated and that a customer at the end of the day, they're speaking to Hilton, right? And they're seeking out that hospitality that Hilton provides. It doesn't matter to them whether the agent is located in, an at-home agent in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or an offshore agent in Manila, or a chat agent sitting in India. That shouldn't matter to them. The level of service that we're providing needs to be seamless, and it's all Hilton at that point. So, what I think about all the time is, how we do that better and how we orchestrate that better and make that an even smoother relationship with our partners.
And I think, John, again, continuing to, keep involved with our community as far as some of those insights and best practices about alignment and I think inclusion together versus exclusion is the way to go. It sounds simple on paper, and I think most of our listeners, especially I'm speaking to our corporate brand end users, would agree to that. But we truly can help and enable the outcome of the partnership success with having kind of that direct. It's a togetherness. It's a true partnership. It's not a supplier-buyer relationship. It's really about the ultimate success and goal of the end customer. And I would challenge the partners. I would leverage as much as the technology as possible, get their insights, get their best practices, and build upon those foundations. If nothing else, your customers are expecting that and need that. And one of the things, John, we have done based on the buyer side, a significant interest is we've created an outsourcing interest group at Execs in the Know. And John, you've been so gracious to kind of help spearhead that over the last couple of years. We've had our twice a year gathering meetings. In fact, for the listeners, if you are a corporate end user, we're going to be at Microsoft December 6th for our next outsourcing meeting. You should come out. We've got 40 to 50 brands. We're spending the day talking about best practices across the board, from contract pricing, governance, account management. We could list a number of topics, but it's a great together one-day event. You can reach me, Chad, at execsintheknow.com if you want more information. On that note, John, why did you feel the need? What are your goals? I mean, what would be your push to the corporate end users listening right now to get involved, and why, and where you were feeling and thinking, and what was that void?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Chad, I've attended two of the the outsourcing events that you host. I actually hosted one here in Dallas back in May, and I love the level of engagement. I love the thought sharing, the best practices sharing that we have. But I've wanted more. You and I have spent a lot of time talking about this, about what is it that we can do. They're one-day sessions, great for networking. But how can we kind of bridge the gap between the spring and the fall? So, the idea behind this was just that. Let's get a group of folks together that are interested in where the industry is going, that are invested in where the industry is going, and get together. And it's not a big commitment. We had a meeting just last week, and it's a conference call once every couple of months. For about an hour, and we pick certain topics that we're going to just go a bit deeper than we go in some of the in-person sessions that you host, because we cover a lot of topics there, a lot of meaty information that really warrants a deeper dive. So that's what we're doing. We're going to meet every other month. It's a group of like-minded individuals whose job function is related to managing outsourcing vendor partnerships. We're focusing on the industry side only. We certainly appreciate our vendor partners, and they have so much to offer. And Chad, I know you invite them into your events twice per year, and that's a great forum. But this is really for folks on the industry side to be able to talk freely about some of the challenges that they have, share best practices in a comfortable and a safe environment where they feel like they can talk freely. So. That's the vision for the group. Chad, you've got the know-it-all tool. Certainly that is also foundational to this. And we've had one session, like I've mentioned. We're going to have another one in January. Several of us will be at your outsourcing forum up in Seattle, and we're going to make a community here. I've never built a community before, but we're gonna give it a shot. We've got a lot of interest and a lot of people that I know are vested in the success of this. So, looking forward to working with you to make that happen.
Well, you definitely got my support, and I know a thing or two about building that community, and I'll be happy to give you a long thought there. I will say this, and the brands that are coming out, John, I won't name them, but they're just as recognizable as Hilton, some amazing brands. So it's going to be quite a gathering December 6th with the large users coming out. And regardless if you outsource or don't, are considering it, I mean, still there's so much ways to get involved, because the gig labor force and the changes of the labor, and the thoughts around crowdsourcing and service options to crowdsource and outsourcing, and we could kind of go down a list here. So no excuses, guys. You've got to get involved. I call it #GetInvolved. John, I know our time always goes so fast on these episodes, but I'm going to leave it with this and just say, for our listeners here, again, if you are an end user and you'd like to connect with John, I'm happy to get you guys together. John is so willing to give and share in a very private way, and give you a lot of direct perspective. But you can email me, chad@execsandthough.com, and I will make sure I connect you with John. But John, give us some advice, give us some thoughts, leave this episode with some suggestions, recommendations. Not so much where we start, but what would be the thing you really want to bestow upon the listeners before we end the episode?
Well, that's I think what's most near and dear to my heart is what I was talking about a little bit earlier, and that's really working with the partners to give them a seat at the table, recognize that they're an extension of what you're doing, be as transparent as possible with them. And recognize that it's not just a labor arbitrage anymore. There's so much more that they can bring to the table, and the more that you can share with them, the more they're going to be able to bring back and help you solve some of these problems. Right? They eat, drink, sleep, and live. The BPO world and the customer experience world, and they've got a lot of great ideas. So, would just urge everybody, as you're, if you haven't done it before, if you're doing it today, to think about the approach that you take with the partners, and truly think of them as partners. And like I said, give them a seat at the table, because you're going to get so much more out of it versus just kind of throwing it over the fence and telling them when they're doing something wrong, but not celebrating when they're doing something right, or celebrating what they can bring back to the table and the problems that they can help you solve.
And I was going to say, John, if I was a supplier, you'd be my dream client. I would love to have you as the client. But you know what? There is some success and chemistry in that. And I know in the public domain of this, we couldn't get into some of the specific metrics, but I know the kind of successes you guys have had in this partnership model based on that embedded in philosophy and, basically advocating that you've been doing throughout the episode. So, John, I really thank you. I think you've got to get on a plane this afternoon to head to one of the locations. Someday maybe I'll get your frequent flyer miles. But anyhow, John, really appreciate your time. For our listeners, another episode of Customer Driven. I really want to thank you for your listenership in today's episode. If you want more of this type of content, write me a note. Please rate this episode and subscribe to Customer Driven through iTunes and all the major podcasts distribution channels. So, John, on behalf of Execs of the Know and myself, I cannot thank you enough. You've been a real star for this for this industry, and I appreciate your advocacy, and let's go out and have a lot of fun in 2019. Thank you, John.
Absolutely, Chad. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Customer Driven with Chad McDaniel. If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to rate and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. It really makes a difference in helping others find the podcast. For more information on our customer experience community, please visit execsandtheknow.com.